In the quiet halls of Imperial Japanese military headquarters during the early months of 1942, laughter echoed through rooms filled with maps and strategic plans. Japanese commanders sat around polished tables, their uniforms crisp and decorated with medals earned through years of conquest across Asia and the Pacific. They looked at intelligence reports describing American supply lines, production facilities, and logistical capabilities, and they laughed. They laughed because they believed they understood warfare in a way the Americans never could. They laughed because their own forces had conquered vast territories with minimal supplies, living off the land and moving with lightning speed. They laughed because they thought the American reliance on material abundance was a weakness, a crutch that would crumble when faced with the harsh realities of Pacific Island warfare. But as the months turned to years and the tide of war shifted beneath their feet, that laughter died in their throats. The supply ships kept coming. The ammunition never ran dry. The food, the fuel, the vehicles, the spare parts, the medicine, everything kept flowing like an endless river that could not be dammed or diverted. What the Japanese commanders had mocked as American softness and waste revealed itself as the most powerful weapon of the entire war, a logistical machine so vast and efficient that it could not be stopped, could not be matched, and ultimately could not be defeated. This is the story of how American logistics transformed from a subject of enemy ridicule into an unstoppable force that crushed an empire. To understand why Japanese commanders initially dismissed American logistical capabilities, we must first journey back to the traditions and military philosophy that shaped Imperial Japan in the decades before World War II. The Japanese military culture was built on principles of austerity, self-sacrifice, and spiritual strength over material comfort. Samurai traditions dating back centuries emphasized that a true warrior needed little more than his sword, his honor, and his determination. This philosophy was modernized and intensified during Japan's rapid militarization in the 1920s and 30s, creating an officer corps that genuinely believed superior spirit could overcome material disadvantages. Japanese soldiers were trained to survive on minimal rations, often just rice and pickled vegetables, and they were expected to endure hardships that would break soldiers from other nations. Officers prided themselves on eating the same meager rations as their men, sleeping in the same conditions, and demanding nothing beyond what was absolutely necessary for combat. This wasn't just propaganda or empty rhetoric. Japanese forces had demonstrated this capability time and again during their campaigns in China, Manchuria, and Southeast Asia, where they moved quickly through difficult terrain with supply lines that would have been considered impossibly thin by Western standards. When Japanese planners looked at American military preparations, they saw something that confirmed all their prejudices. They saw an army that seemed to require enormous quantities of supplies for every soldier, mountains of equipment, elaborate base facilities, and constant resupply. To the Japanese mind, this was not strength but dependency, not capability but weakness. They believed that when American forces were cut off from their supply bases, when ships were sunk and supply lines disrupted, these materially dependent troops would collapse like a house built on sand. While Japanese commanders were refining their philosophy of austere warfare, the United States was undergoing an industrial transformation that would reshape the entire global conflict. In December of 1941, when Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor, the American military was ranked approximately 17th in the world in terms of size and capability. The nation had been reluctant to enter another global conflict, still scarred by the memories of World War I and focused on recovering from the Great Depression. But beneath this surface of military unpreparedness lay something far more significant, an industrial capacity unmatched anywhere on Earth. American factories that had been producing automobiles, refrigerators, and consumer goods possessed the machinery, expertise, and scale to produce weapons and military equipment at levels that defied imagination. The transition began almost immediately after Pearl Harbor. President Franklin Roosevelt gave speeches calling for production targets that seemed impossible. He demanded 50,000 aircraft per year when existing production was barely a tenth of that number. He called for millions of tons of shipping to be built when the merchant marine was a fraction of what would be needed. Military and industrial leaders initially thought these targets were propaganda, numbers meant to boost morale rather than actual goals. But Roosevelt and his advisors understood something that the Axis powers did not. They understood that modern warfare had become a contest of industrial output, that victory would go not to the army with the bravest soldiers or the cleverest generals, but to the nation that could produce more weapons, more ammunition, more vehicles, more of everything than the enemy could possibly destroy. The transformation happened with stunning speed. Auto factories in Detroit stopped making cars and started making tanks and aircraft engines. Shipyards that had been nearly empty during the Depression suddenly employed tens of thousands of workers building cargo vessels and warships around the clock. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers, operating machinery, welding steel, assembling aircraft, doing jobs that society had previously reserved exclusively for men. As American industrial production accelerated through 1942 and 1943, a parallel revolution was occurring in the unglamorous but critical field of military logistics. Logistics is the art and science of moving supplies from factories to frontline soldiers, ensuring that ammunition reaches artillery positions, that fuel arrives at airfields, that food gets to hungry troops, and that wounded men receive medical care. It's the work that happens behind the glory of combat, the foundation upon which all military operations rest. American military planners, many of whom came from civilian backgrounds in business and industry, approached logistics with methods that were revolutionary for their time. They used statistical analysis to predict supply needs, calculating how much ammunition would be expended in different types of combat, how much fuel would be consumed by various vehicle types under different conditions, how many spare parts would be needed to keep machinery operational in tropical climates. They created standardized packaging and labeling systems so that supplies could be identified and distributed quickly, even in chaotic combat zones. They developed specialized ships designed purely for carrying cargo efficiently, vessels that could be loaded and unloaded rapidly using innovative techniques. They built floating supply bases, artificial harbors, and mobile repair facilities that could follow advancing forces. Perhaps most importantly, they created redundancy in the system, producing such vast quantities of supplies that shortages became almost impossible. Where Japanese logistics operated on the principle of minimal sufficiency, American logistics operated on the principle of overwhelming abundance. This wasn't waste or extravagance as the Japanese believed, but rather a calculated strategy that ensured operational tempo could be maintained regardless of enemy action or unexpected circumstances. The early months of the Pacific War seemed to confirm Japanese assumptions about American weakness. Japanese forces swept through the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies with stunning speed, capturing vast territories and defeating Allied forces that often possessed numerical superiority. When American forces surrendered at Bataan and Corregidor in the Philippines, Japanese commanders saw confirmation of their beliefs about American softness. These Americans had been cut off from their supply lines and had collapsed, just as Japanese doctrine predicted. But careful observers among the Japanese command might have noticed troubling signs even in these early victories. American forces, even when defeated, possessed quantities of equipment that seemed almost wasteful to Japanese eyes. Captured supply dumps contained more food, medicine, and ammunition than Japanese units would carry for much longer campaigns. American soldiers, even in defeat, were generally better fed and equipped than their Japanese counterparts. But these observations were easy to dismiss in the flush of victory. The turning point that first shook Japanese confidence came in the waters around Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. When American Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August of 1942, Japanese commanders expected to crush this invasion quickly using their proven tactics of rapid movement and aggressive counterattacks. But something different happened. The Americans dug in and stayed. Japanese naval forces fought desperately to cut American supply lines, sinking transport ships and engaging in brutal surface battles in the waters that would become known as Iron Bottom Sound because of all the ships resting on the ocean floor. But for every American supply ship sunk, 2 more appeared. For every ton of supplies destroyed, 3 more tons were delivered. Japanese troops on Guadalcanal, operating at the end of an increasingly tenuous supply line, began to starve, while American forces were regularly resupplied. Japanese reinforcements arrived hungry and exhausted after being transported on warships that could only carry minimal supplies, while American reinforcements arrived fresh and fully equipped on dedicated transport vessels. While combat raged across the Pacific Islands, a quieter but equally decisive battle was being won in American shipyards. The key to maintaining supply lines across the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean was shipping. Lots of shipping, more shipping than had ever been built before. This is where American industrial capacity demonstrated its true power through the Liberty Ship program, one of the most remarkable manufacturing achievements in human history. Liberty ships were cargo vessels designed for mass production using techniques borrowed from the automobile industry. They were welded rather than riveted, which was faster and required less skilled labor. They used standardized components that could be manufactured in different locations and assembled at shipyards. They were not beautiful ships or particularly fast ships, but they were ships that could be built in extraordinary numbers at extraordinary speed. When the Liberty Ship program began, it took nearly a year to build a single vessel. American shipyards refined their techniques, created assembly line methods for shipbuilding, and organized work crews with unprecedented efficiency. Within 2 years, the average construction time for a Liberty ship had dropped to just 42 days. The record was set by the shipyard in Richmond, California, which assembled a complete Liberty ship in just 4 days and 15 hours, a feat that shocked even American observers. But the truly significant number was the total. American shipyards produced 2,700 Liberty ships during World War II, along with hundreds of other cargo vessels and thousands of landing craft. This armada created an oceanic conveyor belt that could not be severed. Japanese submarines and aircraft sank American supply ships throughout the war, but they could never sink them faster than American shipyards could build replacements. For every ship sent to the bottom, 2 new ships joined the fleet. The mathematics of this situation were inescapable and devastating for Japan. No amount of bravery or tactical skill could overcome the simple fact that America could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. By 1943, American industrial production had reached levels that seemed almost surreal. Factories were producing 1 aircraft every 5 minutes, a tank every 7 minutes, a ship every day. The numbers were so large that they strained comprehension. American factories produced 300,000 aircraft during World War II, compared to 70,000 for Japan. American shipyards launched tens of millions of tons of shipping, while Japanese shipyards struggled to replace the merchant vessels being sunk by American submarines. American factories produced 88,000 tanks, while Japan produced only a few thousand. But raw numbers alone don't capture the full picture of American logistical dominance. It was not just the quantity, but the entire system surrounding production and distribution that gave America its decisive advantage. American forces fighting in the Pacific received a continuous flow of not just weapons and ammunition, but also all the supporting supplies that made sustained combat operations possible. They received food in quantities and varieties that maintained morale and health. They received replacement uniforms and boots, so soldiers weren't fighting in rags. They received medicine and medical supplies that kept disease rates lower than in any previous war. They received mail from home, recreational equipment, and even ice cream, which might seem frivolous but which significantly affected troop morale during long campaigns in brutal tropical conditions. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, increasingly faced the grim reality of fighting without adequate supplies of any kind. As American submarines devastated Japanese merchant shipping and American forces captured island after island, Japanese supply lines grew longer and more vulnerable, while American supply lines grew shorter and more secure. Japanese troops on bypassed islands faced slow starvation. Japanese forces still in contact with supply lines received ammunition and weapons, but often lacked food and medicine. Among the most significant but least celebrated American logistical achievements were innovations in specific categories of supply that proved crucial to military effectiveness. Take petroleum products as one example. Modern warfare consumes fuel at rates that would have seemed impossible in earlier eras. Aircraft, ships, tanks, and trucks all require constant supplies of gasoline or diesel fuel. The American military recognized early that fuel would be one of the critical limiting factors in Pacific operations, and they developed an entire system for delivering petroleum products to forward areas. This included specialized tanker ships, portable pipelines that could be laid quickly on captured islands, collapsible fuel storage tanks that could be transported more efficiently than rigid containers, and even fuel drums that were designed for rapid handling and stacking. The famous photograph of American supplies stacked on Pacific beaches often shows thousands upon thousands of 55-gallon drums, each filled with fuel or other liquids, each labeled and tracked, each part of a system that ensured aircraft could fly and vehicles could move. Japanese forces, lacking this sophisticated fuel distribution system, often found their tanks and aircraft immobilized not by enemy action, but by empty fuel tanks. Or consider ammunition, which is consumed at prodigious rates in modern combat. American factories produced 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition during World War II, along with vast quantities of artillery shells, bombs, and other munitions. But production was only part of the challenge. This ammunition had to be transported across oceans, stored in tropical climates without deterioration, distributed to the right units at the right times, and delivered to frontline positions even under enemy fire. American logistics developed specialized ammunition ships with climate-controlled holds, created packaging that protected munitions from moisture and heat, established supply dumps with careful organization and inventory systems, and trained transportation units that could move ammunition safely even in combat zones. One of the most innovative aspects of American Pacific logistics was the development of mobile supply capabilities that allowed the fleet to operate for extended periods without returning to major bases. This was critical in the vast distances of the Pacific, where the nearest major port might be thousands of miles from combat operations. The American Navy created a fleet train of support vessels that turned the combat fleet into a mobile, self-sufficient city on the ocean. This fleet train included oilers that refueled ships at sea, allowing task forces to remain operational for weeks without entering port. It included ammunition ships that could resupply depleted magazines while ships were underway. It included repair ships equipped with machine shops and skilled technicians who could fix battle damage or mechanical problems without requiring vessels to return to shipyards. It included refrigerated supply ships carrying food for crews, hospital ships providing medical care, and even floating dry docks that could accompany the fleet and provide major repair capabilities in forward areas. This mobile logistical capability gave American naval forces an operational flexibility that Japan simply could not match. American carrier task forces could operate continuously in enemy waters, launching strikes, withdrawing to resupply at sea, and returning to action without the vulnerability of entering port. Japanese naval forces, lacking this sophisticated underway replenishment capability, had to return to base regularly for refueling and resupply, limiting their operational tempo and creating predictable patterns that American intelligence could exploit. On land, American forces developed similar mobile supply capabilities. They created engineer units that could rapidly build airfields, roads, and supply dumps on newly captured islands. They developed amphibious supply techniques that allowed materials to be moved from ships to shore, even when proper port facilities didn't exist. They created supply bases that could be packed up and moved forward as the front lines advanced, keeping the logistical tail as short as possible while still maintaining abundant supply flow. Behind all the statistics about production and shipping tonnages were millions of individual human beings whose work made the logistical miracle possible. These were the factory workers in America who worked long shifts in difficult conditions, knowing that the quality of their work could mean life or death for soldiers they would never meet. These were the merchant mariners who sailed supply ships across submarine-infested waters, facing danger every day but rarely receiving the recognition given to combat forces. These were the members of supply and transportation units who loaded ships, drove trucks, operated forklifts, maintained warehouses, and handled the unglamorous but essential work of moving materials. The Army Service Forces, which handled logistics for the American Army, eventually comprised more than 6 million personnel, far exceeding the number in combat units. Women played crucial roles throughout this logistical system, not only in factories but also in administrative positions that tracked supplies, processed paperwork, and coordinated shipments. African American troops, often excluded from combat roles by the racism of the era, served extensively in supply and transportation units, where their work was essential to military success even as they fought against discrimination. The story of the Red Ball Express illustrates the human drama within logistics. This was a convoy system established after D-Day in Europe to rush supplies from Normandy beaches to advancing Allied armies. Trucks ran continuously, day and night, on routes marked with red balls, carrying fuel and ammunition to forces that were advancing faster than supply lines could normally support. The majority of Red Ball Express drivers were African American soldiers who drove under difficult and dangerous conditions, sometimes facing enemy fire, always fighting exhaustion, keeping the army supplied through determination and skill. Similar operations occurred in the Pacific, though less well documented, where supply units worked under tropical heat, facing disease, Japanese attacks, and the constant challenge of difficult terrain. While American logistics grew stronger throughout the war, Japanese logistics progressively collapsed under multiple pressures. The fundamental problem was that Japan, despite its military prowess, was a resource-poor island nation that depended on imports for most of the raw materials needed for modern warfare. The Japanese Empire in 1942 controlled resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia and the East Indies, including rubber plantations, oil fields, and mineral deposits. But controlling resources and successfully transporting them back to Japanese home islands for processing proved to be very different challenges. American submarines, operating with increasing effectiveness as the war progressed, devastated Japanese merchant shipping. In 1942, Japanese merchant tonnage actually increased slightly as captured ships were added to the fleet. But in 1943, losses began to exceed replacements, and by 1944, the Japanese merchant marine was in catastrophic decline. American submarines sank nearly 5 million tons of Japanese shipping during the war, strangling the flow of oil, rubber, food, and other materials to Japan. Without these resources, Japanese factories could not maintain production. Without shipping, supplies could not reach forward forces. Japanese troops on islands across the Pacific found themselves isolated and starving, receiving no supplies at all or only tiny amounts delivered by submarine or fast destroyer runs that could carry minimal cargo. The contrast with American forces on the same battlefields was stark and demoralizing. Japanese soldiers watched American forces eat hot meals from field kitchens while they went hungry. They saw American wounded evacuated quickly in ambulances and treated in well-equipped field hospitals, while their own wounded often received minimal care. They faced American troops wearing clean uniforms and carrying abundant ammunition, while they fought in rags with carefully rationed bullets. Japanese officers who had once laughed at American logistical dependence now saw that dependence revealed as strength, while their own austere self-sufficiency was exposed as inadequate for modern industrial warfare. American strategy in the Pacific, the famous island hopping campaign, was fundamentally a logistical strategy as much as a military one. Rather than attacking every Japanese-held island, American forces bypassed strongly defended positions and captured islands that could serve as bases for further advances. Each captured island became a logistics node, a point where airfields could be built, supply dumps established, and repair facilities created. This strategy leveraged American logistical strength while exploiting Japanese logistical weakness. Bypassed Japanese garrisons, cut off from resupply, withered without American forces needing to fight costly battles. Meanwhile, American forces advancing from one secured island to the next operated at the end of supply lines that grew progressively shorter as bases moved forward. The construction capabilities that American forces demonstrated on captured islands were astonishing. Engineers would land on a captured island and within days have begun constructing airfields. Within weeks, these airfields would be operational, supporting hundreds of aircraft. Within months, the island would have extensive facilities including warehouses, hospitals, repair shops, fuel storage, and living quarters for thousands of personnel. On Okinawa, captured in April of 1945, American forces constructed facilities for 500,000 personnel and thousands of aircraft in preparation for the planned invasion of Japan. The speed and scale of this construction was possible only because American logistics could deliver the necessary materials, the cement, steel, machinery, and fuel in quantities that kept pace with construction schedules. Japanese forces, watching from other islands or from reconnaissance aircraft, could see these massive bases growing like mushrooms after rain, visible proof of American capabilities that far exceeded anything Japan could match. The psychological effects of the logistical imbalance extended beyond the practical military consequences. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated to believe that spiritual strength and martial discipline would overcome material disadvantages, faced a profound crisis of understanding when confronted with the reality of American abundance. They had been taught that Americans were soft, that they would crumble under hardship, that they lacked the warrior spirit necessary for victory. But the evidence before their eyes told a different story. American forces attacked with determination, absorbed casualties, and kept coming with undiminished strength. More troubling still, American forces maintained their effectiveness even under conditions that should have weakened them. Japanese military doctrine held that troops needed to be kept austere and hardened, but American forces who ate well, received mail from home, and had access to recreation fought just as fiercely as austere Japanese troops, perhaps more so because their morale remained higher. Captured American supply dumps became objects of almost fascination for Japanese soldiers. Stories circulated among Japanese forces about the incredible quantities and varieties of supplies Americans possessed. Japanese troops who captured American positions would sometimes spend as much time examining the abandoned supplies as they did preparing defensive positions, marveling at the abundance of food, medicine, and equipment. One Japanese officer, captured late in the war, described the psychological impact during interrogation. He explained that Japanese troops had been confident early in the war because they believed Americans would be easy to defeat once cut off from their supplies. But as the war progressed and Americans never seemed to run out of anything, while Japanese forces grew increasingly desperate, a sense of hopelessness spread. How could they win against an enemy who could replace every loss, who seemed to have infinite resources, who could fight major battles on multiple fronts simultaneously without weakening. By 1945, American logistical dominance had become so absolute that it enabled military operations on a scale that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The invasion of Okinawa in April of 1945 involved more than 500,000 American troops supported by hundreds of ships and thousands of aircraft. The logistics required to support this force were staggering. American supply ships delivered thousands of tons of supplies daily to Okinawa, including food, fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies. The fleet offshore consumed fuel at such rates that tankers operated continuously shuttling from rear bases to the combat area. Aircraft flying from carriers and from newly constructed airfields on Okinawa and nearby islands required thousands of tons of aviation fuel and ordnance. Wounded soldiers and Marines were evacuated through a medical system that moved casualties from front lines to aid stations, to field hospitals to hospital ships to rear area hospitals with efficiency that saved thousands of lives. Japanese defenders on Okinawa, by contrast, fought knowing that no significant reinforcements or supplies would reach them. The Japanese garrison on Okinawa had stockpiled supplies before American invasion, but these stocks were finite and diminishing. Japanese aircraft launched kamikaze attacks against American ships offshore, achieving some successes, but ultimately unable to cut the supply flow that sustained American forces. The contrast was visible even in the physical condition of opposing forces. American troops on Okinawa, despite fighting in brutal conditions for months, remained generally healthy and well-fed. Japanese troops who survived until the end of the campaign were often emaciated and sick, weakened by malnutrition and disease as much as by combat. The planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, which never occurred due to Japan's surrender after the atomic bombings, would have showcased American logistics at its absolute peak. Plans called for marshaling millions of tons of supplies, thousands of ships, and millions of troops for operations that would have dwarfed even the D-Day landings in Europe. When we examine the statistical record of World War II production, the scale of American logistical superiority becomes undeniable. The United States produced more military equipment during World War II than all other combatant nations combined. American factories built nearly 300,000 aircraft while Japan built approximately 70,000. American shipyards launched aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines in numbers that overwhelmed Japanese naval construction. In landing craft alone, those small vessels essential for amphibious operations, American industry produced over 80,000 examples. American factories produced nearly 100,000 tanks and armored vehicles, while Japanese industry managed only a few thousand. American ordnance plants produced 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, enough to give every person on Earth at that time several bullets. Beyond weapons, American industry produced the supporting equipment necessary for modern warfare. American factories built hundreds of thousands of trucks, the unglamorous vehicles that moved supplies from ports to front lines. American industry produced thousands of bulldozers and earth-moving equipment that built the roads, airfields, and bases. American factories produced the spare parts that kept vehicles and equipment operational in harsh tropical conditions. American chemical plants produced the medicines, the sulfa drugs and plasma and morphine, that saved lives. American agriculture, itself mechanized and efficient, produced such enormous food surpluses that America could feed not only its own military, but also Allied forces and civilian populations in liberated areas. The contrast with Japan was stark and grew starker as the war progressed. Japanese production peaked in 1944 and then declined as American bombing and submarine warfare cut resource flows. By 1945, Japanese factories were producing a fraction of their earlier output, sometimes reduced to making weapons in small workshops because major factories had been destroyed or lacked materials. The story of Japanese commanders laughing at American logistics and then being overwhelmed by it contains lessons that extend far beyond World War II. It illustrates the danger of mistaking cultural preferences for universal military virtues. Japanese commanders genuinely believed that their austere approach to supply was superior, that traveling light and living off minimal resources was the mark of a superior military force. This belief was so deeply embedded in Japanese military culture that it became invisible, an assumption so basic that it was rarely questioned. American planners, many coming from business backgrounds, approached logistics not as a question of martial virtue, but as an engineering problem. How do you move the maximum amount of material from point A to point B most efficiently? How do you predict requirements and ensure supplies arrive before they're needed? How do you create redundancy so that no single point of failure can disrupt operations? These weren't questions about warrior spirit or cultural values, but about systems, mathematics, and industrial organization. The Japanese failure to understand American logistics was also a failure of intelligence and imagination. Japanese intelligence services collected information about American industrial capacity, but Japanese commanders often dismissed or minimized this information because it didn't fit their preconceptions. When intelligence reports showed American production figures, Japanese officers sometimes assumed these were exaggerations or propaganda. Even when they accepted the numbers as accurate, they often failed to understand the implications because their own experience and training hadn't prepared them to think about warfare at such scales. This failure of imagination extended to an inability to recognize how warfare itself was changing. World War II was the first truly industrial war, where victory depended more on factory output and supply chains than on tactical brilliance or soldier courage. Japanese commanders, trained in traditions dating back centuries and experienced in campaigns where mobility and aggression had brought victory, struggled to adapt to this new reality. Behind the statistics and strategic analyses lies a human tragedy that should not be forgotten. Japanese soldiers in the Pacific suffered terribly, not primarily from American weapons, but from starvation and disease caused by logistical collapse. On islands cut off from supply, Japanese troops died slowly of malnutrition, their bodies consuming themselves as they continued to man defensive positions. Medical supplies ran out, leaving wounded men to die from infections that simple antibiotics could have cured. Diseases like malaria, dysentery, and beriberi killed more Japanese soldiers than bullets or bombs in many campaigns. Survivors of these island garrisons described nightmarish conditions, eating grass and roots, growing so weak they could barely hold weapons, watching comrades die not in battle but from the slow grinding effects of starvation. Japanese commanders, bound by the same culture that had led them to dismiss American logistics, often forbade surrender even when positions were hopeless, condemning their troops to pointless deaths. The contrast with American forces on the same battlefield was morally troubling in some ways. American troops were well fed, received mail and care packages from home, had access to medical care that would have been considered excellent even in civilian life, and could expect to be rotated out of combat zones after serving their time. They fought a war that was deadly and brutal, but they fought it with the knowledge that their nation was supporting them with every resource available. Japanese soldiers fought with courage and determination that matched any troops in the war, but they fought abandoned by a logistical system that could not sustain them. This was not their failure but the failure of their commanders and the system those commanders created. American logistical abundance, which Japanese commanders had initially mocked as waste and inefficiency, proved to be a powerful force multiplier in unexpected ways. Having more than enough supplies meant that commanders in the field never had to hold back for fear of running out. Artillery units could fire extensive bombardments before attacks without worrying about conserving shells. Amphibious landings could be supported by overwhelming naval gunfire. Aircraft could fly multiple missions daily without fuel concerns. This abundance created a psychological advantage as well. American troops knew that their supply lines were secure, that ammunition would be available when needed, that wounded men would receive care, that replacements would arrive for losses. This knowledge supported morale and aggressiveness in combat. Troops who trust their logistics can take risks and maintain offensive pressure that troops worried about supplies cannot match. The American practice of building up overwhelming supply stocks before major operations, what military planners call logistics buildup, also provided insurance against unexpected developments. When operations took longer than planned or consumed more supplies than anticipated, American forces had the buffer to continue without pause. Japanese forces, operating on minimal logistics, lacked this buffer and often had to halt operations or accept defeat when supplies ran short. There was also an element of economic warfare in American logistical abundance. By producing far more than was strictly necessary, America forced Japan into an unwinnable competition. Japan couldn't match American production even when devoting maximum national effort to military output. The attempt to compete economically exhausted Japanese resources and left the civilian economy in ruins. As World War II ground toward its conclusion in the summer of 1945, the logistical collapse of Japan was complete. American submarines had sunk so much merchant shipping that almost no resources reached the home islands from occupied territories. American bombers were destroying Japanese factories and cities with incendiary raids that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The Japanese military, still possessing millions of troops, was increasingly unable to feed, equip, or move those forces. Japanese commanders planning the defense of the home islands against the expected American invasion faced impossible logistical challenges. They had troops but insufficient ammunition for sustained combat. They had aircraft but no fuel to fly them. They had a population willing to resist but no way to feed them during a protracted campaign. American planners preparing for that invasion faced very different logistics. They were accumulating the largest stockpile of supplies ever assembled for a single military operation, enough to sustain millions of troops for months of intensive combat. That invasion never came because Japan surrendered in August of 1945 after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet Union entered the war. But the logistical reality was already clear before those final blows. Japan had been defeated not by any single battle or campaign, but by the slow strangulation of its supply lines and the complete inability to match American industrial and logistical power. The Japanese commanders who had laughed at American logistics in 1942 were silent by 1945, their armies still brave, still determined, but starving and without hope. The legacy of American logistical triumph in World War II extended far beyond the end of that conflict. The systems, techniques, and organizational methods developed to supply forces across the Pacific became the foundation for American military logistics in all subsequent conflicts. The Cold War military that faced the Soviet Union was built on the assumption that American logistics could support forces anywhere in the world, that supplies would flow abundantly, that material superiority would be maintained. This logistical capability became central to American military power. Korean War, Vietnam War, Gulf War, and all later conflicts saw American forces operating with supply systems that traced their heritage directly back to World War II innovations. The expectation of logistical abundance became embedded in American military culture and doctrine. American forces were trained to operate with the assumption that supplies would be available, that they could expend ammunition freely, that equipment could be replaced, that wounded would receive excellent care. The contrast with World War II Japanese forces also provided enduring lessons for military planners worldwide. The Japanese experience demonstrated that courage, skill, and determination, while necessary for military success, were not sufficient without adequate logistics. Modern military forces, regardless of nationality, now recognize that supply lines are not mere administrative concerns but fundamental strategic assets that must be protected and prioritized. The rise of military logistics as a specialized field of study, the development of supply chain management as both military and civilian discipline, and the recognition that industrial capacity and economic strength are essential components of military power all trace back to the lessons of World War II. The Japanese commanders who laughed at American logistics learned through defeat what American planners understood from the beginning, that modern war is won or lost as much in factories and on supply ships as on battlefields. In the end, the story of Japanese commanders laughing at American logistics until it never ran out is a story about the transformation of warfare itself. The wars of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the wars in which Japanese military traditions were formed, were conflicts where tactical skill, operational maneuver, and soldier courage were dominant factors in victory. Logistics mattered, of course, but it was possible for well-led forces operating on interior lines with minimal supplies to defeat larger but poorly supplied enemies. World War II changed this calculus fundamentally and permanently. The Industrial Revolution had been transforming warfare for generations, but World War II was the first conflict where industrial capacity became the decisive factor. The nation that could produce more, ship more, and supply more would win regardless of tactical or operational skill. American commanders understood this reality, sometimes intuitively and sometimes through bitter experience, and they built a military machine that leveraged American industrial strength as its primary weapon. Japanese commanders, blinded by cultural assumptions and historical experience, failed to understand until too late that the rules had changed, that their traditions of austerity and self-sacrifice, while admirable in some respects, were inadequate foundations for victory in industrial war. The laughter that echoed through Japanese headquarters in early 1942, that contemptuous dismissal of American logistical dependence, became a symbol of misplaced confidence and tragic miscalculation. That laughter died as supply ships kept arriving in endless procession, as American beaches filled with supplies stacked higher than warehouses, as Japanese soldiers starved while American troops ate hot meals, as Japanese ammunition ran low while American artillery fired without limit. The logistics never ran out because American industry and organization had created a system too vast to exhaust, too redundant to disrupt, too powerful to stop. This was not the warfare of romantic tradition, not the clash of warriors testing their spirits against each other, but the grinding mechanical reality of industrial conflict where victory went to the nation that could keep the supply chain unbroken from factory floor to front line. That lesson, learned at such terrible cost by Japan and demonstrated so decisively by America, remains relevant in our modern age when global supply chains and industrial capacity still shape the balance of power among nations. The story of those laughing commanders and the logistics that overwhelmed them is ultimately a story about the danger of fighting the current war with the lessons of the last one, and about the power of systems and organization to overcome even the most determined human courage when those systems operate at sufficient scale.